under the dark canopy of a cursed forest, where the trees whisper secrets and the wind moans like mourning souls, lay the broken body of a young girl. Her breath was shallow, her skin cold, and her eyes wide with the terror of betrayal. She had been dragged, bruised and beaten, into the depths of the woods by hands she once trusted, hands that once embraced her as family. And there, beneath twisted branches and shadowed skies, they left her to die. Not with a sword or fire, but with silence. They left her for the forest to claim, hoping that no trace of her soul would remain. But the forest, ancient and unforgiving, had plans of its own. This story begins not just with pain but with the brutal act of abandonment. The girl, no older than 15, had been marked by her village not with honor or protection but with fear. She had seen something, said something, or simply been something that others didn't understand. In villages where old beliefs ruled the hearts of men, it was often the innocent who were cast as monsters. Some said she was cursed. Others said she had spoken with a spirit that brought drought to their land. But most were too afraid to ask questions. And so, one night they decided to rid themselves of her. The forest itself was a place of legend. No one went there willingly. Its name was never spoken at night, and even the children knew that crossing its edge meant inviting doom. It was said that those who entered the forest with a clean heart could leave again, but those who entered with blood, lies, or sin in their souls would never be seen. The trees there were unlike the ones near the farms and roads. They leaned in, curling around paths that disappeared. Strange lights sometimes danced through the woods, and voices, soft, singing voices, could be heard by travelers at the edges. And yet, this was where they chose to leave her. Not because they thought it would kill her, but because they knew it would do something worse. Something final. Something that would erase her name from the village forever. That was the hope. But what they didn't understand, what they never could, was that the forest does not simply destroy. It listens. It watches. And sometimes when it chooses, it rebuilds. Not as things were, but as they should have been. Stronger. Sharper. Stranger. As the girl lay there, the cold seeped into her bones, but so did something else. Something unseen. Her mind drifted between memories and dreams, visions of her mother's face, the sound of fire crackling, a lullaby that once soothed her at night. Then, slowly, these faded into something deeper, a drumbeat in the distance, like a heart not her own. A whisper in her ear, not in any language she'd learned. And eyes, many eyes, watching her from the dark. The village thought they had ended her story. That no one would find her body. That even if she lived, she'd never find her way back. But in stories passed down in hushed tones, it is said that the forest never forgets. That it holds pieces of every soul cast into it. And sometimes, when the moon is full and the air is thick with silence, it gives those souls back. What returned to the village was not what they had left in the forest. Her steps were slow, deliberate. Her eyes seemed to hold shadows that danced just out of reach. She did not cry. She did not beg. She said nothing. But the silence that followed her into the village square spoke louder than any scream. This is a story of death and rebirth. Of betrayal met with justice. Of spirits that do not rest until balance is restored. It is not just folklore, it is a warning. For in many African cultures, the idea of spiritual justice is not just belief, it is truth. Ancestors watch. Spirits protect the broken, the abandoned, the forgotten. And when a heart full of pain cries out beneath the earth, the ground sometimes answers. Many elders in such villages tell their grandchildren, beware what you cast away in fear. For the thing you throw into the dark may return wearing its own light. And when it does, no fire, no wall, no chant will keep it out. As this tale unfolds, remember that it is not merely about one girl. It is about those who walk through life bearing wounds no one sees, and about the forces that rise when justice is denied. This is about spirits who are not blind to suffering, who reach from beyond to lift the silenced and bury the cruel. Now, I ask you, do you believe something broken can return more powerful? Have you heard of spirits choosing the wounded? If such things stir in the shadows of your ancestors' stories, or if whispers of justice have danced around your dreams, then you are not alone. Comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever seen the silenced rise? Do you believe the forest gives back what the village throws away? Because what came home was not just a girl. Ifiana was born beneath a blood-orange sunrise in a small village nestled at the edge of the Abalumo forest, a place both feared and revered. Her name meant love is everything, and from the moment she entered the world, she brought warmth wherever she went. As a child, Ifiana had eyes that seemed to catch more than just light. They caught truth. When others saw dirt, she saw stories written in footprints. When they heard wind, she listened for voices in it. She was quiet, observant, but her laughter was like songbirds at dawn, clear, full of joy and impossible to ignore. Her early life was filled with innocence and wonder. She ran barefoot through maize fields, danced in the rain with abandon, and sang lullabies she had never been taught. The elders often said she had an old soul. The healer woman, Ayakulu, once told her mother that the child had been here before. But Ifianya's mother, gentle and soft-spoken, would just smile and say, "She is just curious." Curious she was. From the time she could walk, she found her way to sacred groves and hidden springs. Unlike other children who feared the whispering trees or the silence of the forest's edge, Ifiana sat among the roots and listened. Animals approached her without fear, and the wind often carried her name like a chant. While other children told stories for fun, Ifianya's tales had detail, too much detail. She described places she had never visited, spoke of ancestors as if she'd met them. People started whispering. Her father, strong but wary, began to grow distant. Her mother tried to protect her, telling her to be quiet, to smile but not speak too much. The world does not always understand light, she warned. But even as a young girl, Ifiana could not dim herself. She loved her family, her village, and her forest. But love, as she would learn, was not always returned. The trouble began when her mother died suddenly. Some say by fever, others suspect poison. With her mother gone, Ifianya's world darkened. Her father, now alone and brooding, remarried a woman named Amawanmi. Beautiful, poised, but cold as river stone, Amawanmi did not like Ifiana from the start. She said the girl had wandering eyes. That she looked through people instead of at them. She whispered in the night that the child was marked. And yet, Ifiana tried. She swept the house before dawn, helped with the firewood, fetched water from the farthest well. But nothing pleased her stepmother. Her father no longer looked her in the eye. He became a shell, letting Amawanmi steer the house with a bitter grip. What made it worse was that people started coming to Ifiana, quietly at night. A woman whose child had fallen sick came to ask if she had seen what was wrong. A farmer losing his crops swore that Ifianya's touch on the soil made it softer. These visits fed the fire of jealousy. Amawanmi, already fearful of the girl's gifts, now felt her own place in the village slipping. She began a slow campaign of isolation. First came the whispers, that Ifiana spoke to the trees. That she knew things children shouldn't. Then came the punishments. No food unless her chores were finished before sunrise, no bed if she was caught speaking to imaginary things. Then came the slaps. And yet Ifiana said nothing. She bore it all with the silence of the forest after rain. But inside something stirred. Not hate, she never allowed that, but a growing sense of separation. Of not belonging. Of being called elsewhere. The turning point came one night when she was caught helping an old blind man find his way home. Her stepmother claimed she was trying to lure the spirits into the house. The next morning her father wouldn't look at her. That night they planned it. She heard them whisper, "The forest will take her. That's what it wants anyway." And so, before the first rooster crowed, Ifiana was dragged from her mat, her mouth covered, her wrists bound. Her eyes widened, but not from fear, from sorrow. She did not scream. She simply looked up at the night sky and said goodbye to the stars. They walked her into the forest. The stepmother, 2 cousins, and a neighbor who had once asked her for help. They left her by the old stone altar, where offerings were once made to spirits that no longer had names. And there they pushed her down. Art. She hit her head. Blood trickled. Then silence. They walked away, whispering prayers to protect themselves from what they had done. But even as her body failed her, something ancient stirred. The ground beneath her warmed. The trees leaned closer. The wind stopped its breath. And Ifiana, with her last fading thought, did not cry out for help. She simply whispered, "I am ready." You see, even as a child she had always been drawn to the edges of things, where spirit and earth touched, where past and present blurred. She had always belonged to something older. Her connection to nature was not a curiosity. It was a bond, a calling. The signs had always been there, the way birds never fled from her shadow, how flowers bloomed beneath her footprints, how she hummed and the rain answered. But no one had listened. The betrayal that cast her into the forest was not just human, it was spiritual. It was the world, afraid of what it could not name, trying to erase a girl who was more than just flesh and blood. And yet, that same world would come to realize that you cannot abandon what the spirits have already claimed. You cannot silence a voice carried by wind and rooted in earth. Ifiana's story, like the girl herself, was never meant to stay buried. Her breath, shallow and scattered, still stirred beneath the leaves. Her blood marked the soil. Her heart, even bruised, still beat with a rhythm older than drums. She was not alone. And the forest was listening. The sun rose dull and gray the morning Ifiana was led into the forest. A sky without light, as though even the heavens mourned what was about to happen. The village bustled with its usual rhythm. Roosters crowed, pots clanged, babies wailed, but within the narrow walls of her father's compound, silence sat like a stone. She had awoken to rough hands. No words, just the hiss of breath and the tightening of ropes around her wrists. Two of her cousins, boys who once played with her under the mango tree, now wore expressions like stone. Their eyes never met hers. Behind them, Nwabis stood still, arms crossed, her voice cold and final. She does not belong here anymore. Ifiana wanted to speak, to ask why, to beg her father to stop them. But he was not there. He had left in the night, or maybe he was hiding in the back room, listening, pretending not to hear. That silence, that refusal to act, was the loudest betrayal of all. They led her out while the village still slept. She wore only her night wrapper, thin and frayed. The morning dew bit at her skin, and her bare feet left ghostly imprints on the wet earth. They did not bind her ankles, perhaps believing she wouldn't run. And they were right, she didn't. She walked quietly, one step after another, her eyes wide open. Not from fear, not yet, but from confusion, heartbreak. The journey into the forest was slow and deliberate. The path twisted like a snake, overgrown with vines and shadows. As the trees grew thicker, the air grew colder. Birds stopped chirping. Even the wind seemed to halt at the boundary between the village and the ancient woods. Nwabis whispered prayers under her breath, protection charms, words to ward off spirits. The cousins said nothing. When they reached a clearing deep within Abalumo forest, she knew it was the end. A stone altar stood at its center, ancient and cracked, covered in moss and dried blood from forgotten rituals. This was not an accident. This was planned. A place where the old gods were once fed. A place where things were taken, and never returned. Nwabis spoke then. This forest knows what you are. It will claim you. And we will finally be free. Ifiana tried to speak, but the knot in her throat was too thick. Tears ran silently down her face. One of the cousins pushed her forward. Her knees hit the stone. Pain shot through her. The other boy took a small calabash from a sack and poured something dark onto the altar. Palm wine maybe, or blood. Then they turned and left. No final glance. No hesitation. She sat there for a moment, numb. Then she stood. She ran. Not far, just into the trees, stumbling and tripping, hands bleeding from thorns and sharp rocks. She screamed, not knowing what else to do. Please? Somebody. Anybody. But the forest swallowed her cries. She wandered for hours. Or was it days? Time lost meaning. Hunger gnawed at her belly like rats. Her lips cracked from thirst. Her skin was covered in bites and scratches. Her feet bled. Her body weakened. But it was not just the body that suffered, it was the spirit. The betrayal wasn't just cruel. It was total. Her father had abandoned her. The woman who pretended to care had discarded her like waste. The boys who once laughed with her had watched her fall and done nothing. She curled under a tree and wept, her voice barely a whisper. Why? But someone, heard her. The forest stirred. First it was the wind, though no leaves moved. Then came the sound of breathing, soft and deep, like something asleep was beginning to wake. The branches above creaked not from weight but from awareness. The roots beneath her shifted, ever so slightly. Ifiana blinked. Was she imagining it? Then came the whispers. Not in language. Not at first. But in feeling. In the rustling of leaves that said, "We see you." In the hoot of an owl that felt like an answer. In the warmth that spread through the ground beneath her, even as her body shivered. And the eyes, so many eyes. Not seen directly but sensed. Shapes in the shadows, figures between trees, movement where there should be none. Every sound was magnified. Every silence was a voice. The forest was not a place. It was a being. And it was watching. She moved deeper, unable to stop. Each step brought her closer to the center, though she did not know what center. Vines parted before her like curtains. Thorns bent out of her way. Trees leaned slightly, guiding her. It was not mercy. It was purpose. She stumbled into another clearing, smaller than the first. There in the middle sat an old drum, half buried in moss. Its surface was cracked, but something about it pulsed. She approached it slowly, falling to her knees. Her fingers reached out and touched it. The drum beat. Not from her hand. On its own. Boom, boom. Her breath caught. Boom, boom, boom. With each beat she felt her pain shifting. The hunger faded. The cold retreated. The shame began to burn away. The whispers returned louder now. Still not words but memories. Her mother's lullabies. The laughter of ancestors she had never met. The cries of spirits long silenced. They were calling to her. Not as a child. Not as a victim. But as one of them. A girl who had been broken, was being reforged. The forest wrapped around her like a cloak, not to smother but to shield. It did not ask her name. It already knew. It did not ask her story. It had witnessed it. She lay there in the clearing as night fell. No fire. No food. No safety. But she was not afraid. The same forest that had once terrified the villagers had embraced her. What they feared she now understood. They feared its power. Its judgment. Its memory. And now it had given itself to her. She was still wounded. Still weak. But she was no longer alone. And the forest was no longer silent. Ifianya's body gave out just as the first nightfall swallowed the forest. Her limbs, bruised and cold, trembled with exhaustion, and her heartbeat slowed until it became nearly imperceptible, a mere whisper beneath skin and bone. Her breath came in shallow waves. Each exhale felt like the last. She collapsed beneath the arch of a sprawling irako tree, the roots curling like ancient fingers around her broken form. Above her, the canopy blotted out the stars and darkness crept in like a lover. It would have been easy, so easy, to slip away. To become another forgotten whisper lost to the hungry forest. But the forest was not hungry for her. It had chosen her. As her breath stilled, the world around her changed. Time bent. The air grew thicker not with fog but with memory. The trees no longer stood silent. They hummed with a song only the dying could hear. And then the ground opened, not with cracks or tremors but with spirit. A faint, greenish-blue light pooled from the soil. Then shadows emerged, first small and fluid, shaped like smoke. Then figures, clearer, more defined. Some were old women draped in moss and bark, with beads that clicked like bones when they moved. Others were tall, genderless beings with eyes like glowing coals. And behind them all, something greater stirred, a presence both intimate and infinite, neither man nor woman, but an essence, ancient, feminine, powerful. The spirits had come. But not to take her soul. They were here to awaken it. The lead spirit stepped forward. Her skin was the color of earth after rain. Her voice was neither loud nor soft. It simply was, like thunder that rumbles in the bones. You have been broken, she said. But not destroyed. Another spirit circled Ifianya's limp body, whispering in a tongue long forgotten by the living. They cast you into the mouth of death. But death does not want you. A third leaned close, brushing a glowing finger across Ifianya's forehead. The touch sent a wave of heat through her skull, and her body arched with a sudden jolt. Though her eyes remained closed, she saw everything. She was no longer in the forest. She stood in a realm between life and afterlife, a space made of mist, music and memory. In this realm, time moved like a river in reverse. She saw visions, her mother singing to her under the stars, her childhood feet dancing in rain puddles, the first time she hummed to heal a bird's broken wing. And then, she saw what she had forgotten. The eyes of her grandmother, the village priestess who had once whispered to her, "Your voice holds power. Not just to speak, but to call, to command, to remember." The spirit realm revealed truths the living had hidden from her. She was not merely a girl. She was a vessel, chosen before birth by the matrons of the forest, a lineage of women bound to nature, to song, to spirit. Her voice was never just her own, it was part of a greater resonance, a harmonic memory of those who came before. In this sacred vision she was led to a lake. Its waters were black but shimmered with silver light. The lead spirit said, "Enter." Ifianya hesitated. Her body still ached, her skin still bore the scars of betrayal. But something inside her, a flicker of strength long dormant, stirred. She stepped into the lake. The water was neither cold nor warm, it was knowing. It wrapped around her like silk and fire. As she submerged, the darkness around her became lit with symbols, glowing sigils in the shapes of drums, eyes, mouths and trees. Each one etched itself into her skin, painless but permanent. Her blood sang. Her bones danced. Her very breath became rhythm. Underwater she screamed, not in fear or pain but release. And though no air left her mouth, the forest heard her. Her scream became a song. When she emerged from the lake, her body had changed. The wounds remained but they no longer hurt. Her skin glistened faintly under the moonlight. Her hair, once matted and dirty, flowed like vines in a breeze. Her eyes opened and they no longer looked merely human, they pulsed with green fire, ancient and piercing. She could not speak in the old way. Her voice, burned by betrayal, had not returned. But she could still call. She placed her hand over her chest, and with a single hum, the trees bowed. The animals fell silent. The wind paused. She had become more than girl. She was now echo, vessel, oracle. When she walked, no sound betrayed her steps, not because she was hiding, but because the forest itself carried her. The roots shifted beneath her feet, creating paths. The spirits walked with her, some inside her, others around her like a cloak. The air no longer chilled her skin, it whispered guidance. She moved through the woods like a legend in motion. And though the village still slumbered, unaware of what stirred beneath their sacred trees, something shifted in their dreams. Mothers tossed in their sleep. Children cried out, clutching at the air. Elders whispered old chants they hadn't spoken in decades. Something was coming. Ifiana did not know what would come next. But she knew this. She had died in the forest. And something else had risen. She was not saved by mercy. She was transformed by justice. She was no longer the broken girl. She was the daughter of the forest. The breath between the drums. The voice behind the wind. And soon all who had left her for dead would know. She had returned. She came back not with trumpets or celebration, but with the sound of dry leaves cracking under bare feet. The first to see her was an old hunter named Oena. His one good eye squinted against the rising mist as he approached the river's edge, basket in hand, heart full of the ordinary. But what he saw that morning erased every notion of the ordinary from his mind forever. There, rising from the mist like a figure carved from the dawn itself, was Ifiana. She was barefoot. Her feet were dirty, her skin kissed by sun and shadow, but there was no sign of the decay or wildness the forest should have forced upon her. Her dress was tattered, yes, but the way it clung to her body, torn and flowing, made her look like a spirit more than a survivor. Her hair had grown into thick, uncombed coils adorned with dried flowers and fallen leaves. Her eyes, oh, her eyes, shimmered not with life but with knowledge. A kind of knowing that unsettled the old man to his marrow. Oena dropped his basket and fell to his knees. Agwagu be praised, he muttered, voice cracking. She returns? Word spread through the village like wildfire caught in dry wind. Some ran to their shrines. Others shut their doors and peered through slits, clutching amulets or muttering prayers they had long forgotten. Children hid behind their mothers, sensing the shift in the air without fully understanding it. A few brave souls, mostly women and elders, came forward to meet her. They offered food, water, even tears. But Ifiana took nothing. She only stared, silent and unreadable, as though listening to something far behind the veil of the visible. The ones who had betrayed her, those who had tied her wrists, whispered the lies, turned their backs, or stood silently while she was led to the forest, felt it immediately. Guilt bloomed in their stomachs like rot. Some fell ill. One man, a relative of her stepmother, vomited violently the moment he heard she was back. Another woman began sleepwalking, waking every morning at the forest's edge with scratches down her arms and no memory of how she got there. Ifiana didn't need to accuse anyone. Her presence was a mirror. People looked at her and saw the truth reflected back at them, ugly, raw, undeniable. On the fourth night after her return, she spoke. She stood beneath the old kola tree in the village square. Elders and children gathered, watching her in silence. Her voice came softly at first, no more than a breath. But with each word the air thickened. The night stilled. I asked for mercy, she said. The words hung like blades. I was answered with fire. A shudder rippled through the crowd. A woman fainted. A baby screamed. Dogs howled from distant compounds. Somewhere behind the crowd, someone vomited again. But the forest, she said, lifting her gaze to the stars, does not forget. That was all. She said nothing more. And yet, the village would never be the same again. After her return, strange things began to happen. The old well, long dried, began to bubble with fresh water, but only when she stood near it. The shrine of the ancestors, once dull and neglected, lit up with flames each time she passed. Smoke curled into shapes, women dancing, trees weeping, eyes watching. One night, an elder confessed publicly. He said he had been part of the plot to send her away. He wept until his knees gave out. The next morning he was found asleep at the forest's edge, smiling but lifeless. The trees had claimed him. Another villager, a young man who had once mocked her singing voice and called her too proud, was found mute. His tongue intact, but no sound could escape his lips. He now spent his days in silence, following her like a shadow as if in search of redemption. Ifiana never blamed them aloud. She didn't need to. She began sleeping in the ruins of her late grandmother's hut, which had mysteriously survived a fire many years before. No one had dared touch it since. Now, strange lights danced above it at night, and drumming could be heard, though no hands played. The village healer once attempted to approach her to examine her for madness. That night, he dreamed of a woman with glowing eyes who pressed a finger to his chest and whispered, "It is not madness but memory. She remembers what you tried to forget." He woke screaming. Despite the fear, something else was growing in the village: respect, reverence. The women began to come to her in pairs or alone. Some brought gifts, cloth, beads, dried herbs. Others came only with tears. They sat at her feet and listened, not to her words but to the silence she carried. And in that silence, some heard their own pain echoing back, soothed by something greater. The children began to sing old songs again, songs that had nearly vanished, songs that Ifiana used to sing beneath the mango tree before her exile. One child even claimed that Ifiana taught her a song in her sleep, and that when she sang it, the wind would listen. Not everyone welcomed her, of course. Her stepmother stayed locked inside her compound, lighting incense night and day, hoping the smoke would ward off whatever judgment was coming. Her brothers no longer walked freely through the village. One left entirely and was never heard from again. But most people could not deny it. Ifiana had returned and the forest walked with her. They tried to rationalize it. Some called it a miracle. Others called it a curse. The elders debated calling for a cleansing, but none could agree on who exactly needed cleansing. And all the while Ifiana moved like the wind, seen but untouchable. On market day she stood at the edge of the stalls. Without saying a word, she lifted her hand and every trader went silent. Then she simply nodded once and they resumed, but slower, more mindful. Old rivalries began to dissolve. Secrets long hidden bubbled to the surface. People began confessing to wrongs they had committed, seeking forgiveness, not from her but from the spirits they now knew she carried within her. The village was changing. Because she had changed. And no one knew what she truly was now. A girl? A ghost? A vessel? All they knew was this. She was left for dead. But what came back was not just a girl. She did not ask for followers, but they came anyway. Slowly at first, curious glances, tentative steps. Children were the first to approach her freely, unafraid. They followed her like chicks after a hen, their laughter softening the tension that wrapped the village like an invisible rope. Ifiana, with her glowing eyes and silent steps, had become something more than herself. She had become a vessel, a symbol, a bridge between the living and the unseen. Her power did not erupt all at once. It unfurled gradually, like mist from the forest creeping over farmland, undeniable and steady. One day, a child with a fever touched her hand and fell asleep in her lap. By evening the fever had vanished. Another day, a woman who had not conceived in years laid her hands on Ifiana's shoulder during a prayer circle. Weeks later the woman's belly began to swell. But not all her power was soft. When she passed by certain compounds, especially those connected to the betrayal, winds would rise from nowhere, lifting dust into spirals that howled like grieving spirits. Doors slammed without warning. Fire sputtered. Goats ran bleeding from empty courtyards. Some villagers whispered that these were mere coincidences. But others, especially the elders, knew better. They remembered the old tales, tales of chosen vessels, of spirits marking the wounded and raising them as messengers. Ifiana never confirmed these rumors. She did not boast. She rarely spoke at all. Yet her silence spoke volumes. Her former stepmother, once so proud, always with her head held high, began to deteriorate. Her hair turned gray in a matter of days. She wept without knowing why. At night, she would scream of shadows pressing against her skin, whispering Ifiana's name with voices that echoed like trees moaning in the wind. Another betrayer, a man who had helped tie the knots around Ifiana's wrists, went mad. He was found in the forest days later, naked and muttering, "She walks between the leaves. The trees know." The trees saw it all. He clawed at his own ears, trying to rip out whatever it was he had heard. He did not return to the village. The forest took him. Some villagers tried to intervene, offering sacrifices, calling for protection rituals, even suggesting that Ifiana be taken to a distant priest to be cleansed. But none of these efforts bore fruit. Every time her name was mentioned in ritual, the fires would die. The goat would refuse to move. The shells cast on the ground would scatter away, as if the spirits themselves refused to speak against her. Children continued to follow her. They said she told them stories without speaking. That in dreams she walked beside them and sang songs from before their births. One child, no more than 5, claimed that Ifiana taught him the name of his great-great-grandmother, and when he repeated it, the old matriarch in his house wept and said, "That name has not been spoken in 90 years." Stories like these spread quickly. One morning a group of women gathered outside her hut. They brought gifts, not offerings of appeasement but of gratitude. Beads, palm oil, herbs, and cloth dyed in sacred patterns. They sat with her in silence, not asking for blessings, only wanting to be near. Some cried. Others simply closed their eyes and felt peace for the first time in years. Even the elders began to murmur among themselves. "She walks with the mark," one whispered. "She is not alone," another added. "The forest watches through her eyes." "She is the return of the forgotten ones," an old priestess said, "the ones buried too deep for memory but not deep enough for silence." Her powers were not flashy or grand. She did not raise the dead. She did not fly. But her presence changed things. Trees bent slightly in her direction when she passed. Birds stopped singing until she had moved on. Crops bloomed faster in gardens she sat near. Water tasted sweeter from the well she drank from. And in dreams, those sacred places where truth walks unhidden, many villagers saw her. In some dreams she stood over a great fire, chanting in a language older than the hills. In others she danced on a river of stars. In all of them, her eyes were lit like twin moons, and behind her stood figures cloaked in bark, mist, and memory. The betrayers suffered most. Each night they were haunted. Dreams turned to nightmares. They saw the moment they had abandoned her, relived it with sharper clarity. But in their dreams the forest did not accept her quietly, it snarled, cried out, and marked them. Some woke with scratches on their bodies, bruises they could not explain, tongues swollen with guilt. One woman confessed publicly before the village. She had not tied the rope, but she had looked away. "I heard her crying," she said, weeping. "I heard her crying and I did nothing. The spirits won't let me sleep." Ifiana listened in silence. Then she stood, approached the woman, and pressed her thumb gently to the woman's forehead. The woman collapsed. When she awoke she remembered nothing, but she smiled for the first time in years. As the moon waxed and waned, the village's heartbeat changed. Once divided by fear, envy, and tradition, they began to unite, not through force but through reverence. They started cleaning the old shrines, telling their children stories of the forest and its ancient powers. Drums were played again at night. Women danced barefoot in the sand, invoking the mothers of old. And Ifiana remained at the center, not a queen, not a priestess, but something in between. She healed a boy with a crooked spine by simply resting her palm on his back for 3 days straight. She predicted a flood 3 nights before it came, and instructed the villagers to build higher ground shelters. She pointed to a mango tree once and said, "There is something beneath it." When they dug, they found a buried mask carved from wood and bone, an artifact lost for generations. One day, a delegation from a neighboring village arrived. They had heard the whispers. They brought kola nuts and goats, requesting her presence to help with a long drought. She did not speak. She only took a bowl of water, dipped her fingers in it, and handed it to them. They returned home and the rains came that week. Ifiana's power was no longer just mystery, it was legend in the making. The village elders called a meeting, their voices low and trembling with awe. "She must be honored," one said. "She must be protected," said another. "But what is she?" a younger one asked. They could not answer. What was clear was that Ifiana had returned not just as a girl, not merely as a survivor, but as a living embodiment of something older and wilder. A reckoning. A blessing. A force. She did not come back alone. Something had walked with her from the forest. Something still did. The drums began at dawn, low, heavy, and rhythmic like the heartbeat of the earth itself. No one summoned them. They started on their own, echoing through the mist-laden trees, bouncing off the clay walls of the village, calling every soul from their home with a sound that could not be ignored. The villagers had known this day was coming. They had felt it in their bones, in their restless dreams, in the eerie quiet that sometimes gripped the air whenever Ifiana walked past. The forest had waited long enough. The spirits had watched in silence. But now they stirred, not for vengeance alone but for balance. A space was cleared in the center of the village, the old circle where ancestors were once honored but had long been left untended. Ifiana stood there not as a girl, not as a victim, but as something reborn. Her hair had grown long and unkempt, tangled with feathers, bits of bark, and red earth. Her eyes glowed faintly, as if the dawn itself had taken shelter in them. Her silence was not empty, it pulsed, it hummed. It demanded attention. Elders gathered first, wrapped in their oldest ceremonial cloths, eyes wide with reverence and fear. Women followed, some clutching their children, others clutching offerings. Men, especially those with secrets, came last, eyes darting, faces pale. The betrayers stood at the edges. Some tried to hide among the crowd. Others stood rigid, as if daring the day to pass without their names being spoken. But the spirits had not forgotten. Ifiana stepped forward, carrying a gourd. It was bound in vines and painted with symbols older than the village itself. She set it down at the center and began to dance, not in the joyful, celebratory way the village once knew, but in a slow, solemn motion that mimicked the swaying of branches and the slithering of river currents. The earth seemed to breathe beneath her feet. Dust rose in patterns. The wind whispered names. Then she stopped. She raised her hands, and from behind her, the forest answered. Leaves rustled though there was no breeze. Birds took to the sky as if fleeing something too powerful to witness. The drums, those that no one played, beat louder, faster, echoing like thunder. She opened her mouth. But instead of a voice, a sound like the rush of wind through 1,000 trees burst forth. The villagers fell silent. Some fell to their knees. Others gasped. And then the ritual began. She took the gourd and poured its contents into a circle drawn on the earth, dark red liquid, thick as blood, mixed with ash and river clay. As it soaked into the soil, the wind died. A heavy silence took its place. Then she pointed, first to a man standing at the back, trembling. You tied the rope, the wind whispered through the trees. The man dropped to the ground, weeping. It wasn't my idea, he shouted. They made me do it. Ifiana turned slowly, her eyes now locked on an elder woman wrapped in fine cloth. The woman's lips trembled. You gave the order, the wind spoke again. The woman fell to her knees. I thought she was a danger. I thought she would bring shame. Then Ifiana walked in a slow circle, and the air shimmered with visions. The villagers began to see the truth. They saw the day she was betrayed, replayed in the wind like a living memory. They saw her bound, gagged, dragged into the forest. They heard her cries. They saw the faces of those who had watched and turned away. Those who had whispered lies, who had stoked fear, who had smiled at her suffering. Gasps echoed. Cries rang out. Some villagers covered their faces, unable to watch. Others stared, finally understanding what had been buried. And Ifiana, silent through it all, raised her hands again. The forest's will, now awakened, spoke through her. The judgment was not random. It was precise. To those who harmed with hands, your hands shall never know peace, the spirits intoned. The man who tied the rope screamed, clutching his palms as blisters formed. He collapsed trembling. To those who betrayed with words, your tongues will taste ash until truth is spoken. A gossiping elder coughed violently, ash falling from her mouth until she confessed her lies between sobs. To those who watched and said nothing, your dreams shall not rest until you speak. Silence swept the crowd as dozens of villagers bowed their heads, weeping openly. Then in the softest voice Ifiana spoke. It was barely more than a whisper, but it struck every heart. Justice is not vengeance. It is remembering. She stepped back, letting the spirits take their final course. A great gust of wind swept the circle. The gourd shattered. The blood-soaked earth dried instantly. The drums stopped. Then stillness. No one moved. And then the forest spoke one last time, not in accusation but in balance. Some must pay. Some must repent. But all must remember. Ifiana's body swayed. A small girl ran forward and caught her hand, steadying her. Around the circle, children emerged from the crowd, surrounding her, not in fear but in awe. She looked at the elders. Will you hide me again? She asked. They shook their heads. Will you silence truth again? They fell to their knees. No, the oldest one said. Never again. The rest of the village followed. Kneeling not before a girl but before justice. Before truth returned. Before the spirits that had waited for reckoning. Ifiana did not stay in the center. She walked quietly to the edge of the circle, stood at the base of the tree nearest the forest's mouth and closed her eyes. And though no one else could see them, those who still carried the gift felt it, the presence of the ancient ones behind her. Watching. Waiting. Balanced. Justice had been served. Not with blood but with memory. Not with violence but with truth. The forest had spoken. And through her, it would never be silenced again. Once, the villagers had cast her aside, abandoning her in the depths of the forest, believing they had rid themselves of a curse. They had wronged her in the most cruel and unimaginable ways, thinking they could erase her from their lives. Yet, the very forest that had been the scene of her torment was now the cradle of her rebirth. In the silence of the woods, Ifiana found strength not just as a girl but as something more, something otherworldly. When she had first disappeared, the villagers rejoiced, thinking they had silenced the ominous whispers of the spirits that seemed to follow her. They had been wrong. The forest had claimed her, but it also changed her, weaving her spirit into the earth, making her one with the land. In that moment of union, the powers of the forest, the ancestral spirits, and the very essence of nature itself had flowed into her, transforming her into something beyond human understanding. Ifiana became a being of both flesh and spirit, an embodiment of the land's power, a force neither fully alive nor entirely dead. Her return was not heralded by a grand procession or a moment of loud revelation. It was a quiet event, one that began with whispers and the subtle shifting of shadows. It was as if the forest itself had exhaled, releasing the girl who had once been its prisoner. She emerged from the darkness of the woods, her presence unmistakable yet serene, like the first rays of dawn breaking through the mist. Her hair, once matted and wild, flowed with an unnatural beauty, shimmering with a light that seemed to come from within. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly fire, and in them there was a deep, ancient wisdom. The village had changed in her absence, but not for the better. Their crops had failed, the livestock had fallen sick, and a mysterious sickness had begun to spread among the people. It was as if the village had fallen under a curse, the very land itself turning against them. The elders whispered that it was the spirits of the forest, angered by their cruelty to Ifiana, that had cursed them, punishing them for their injustice. As Ifiana approached the village, she could hear the frantic whispers of the villagers, the fear in their voices. The people knew something was wrong. They could feel the change in the air, the way the wind seemed to speak in strange tongues. The land had shifted and they had no power to reverse it. They had wronged her, and now the spirits were coming to collect. The ones who had been the architects of her suffering, those who had led the charge in her abandonment, felt the first stirrings of their fates. Old Nwabis, the village chief, was the first to meet his end. He had been the one to lead the ritual that had bound Ifiana to the forest, believing that by casting her out, he would rid the village of her. But now his mind was failing him. He began to hear voices in the night, low guttural whispers that seemed to come from every direction. He would wake in the dark, drenched in sweat, and see shadows flitting just beyond his reach. Madness crept in like a slow poison, gnawing at the edges of his mind. The other villagers watched helplessly as he began to lose his grip on reality, speaking to people who weren't there and wandering aimlessly through the village, his once proud stature reduced to that of a broken man. Nwando, the village healer, had always been one of Ifiana's staunchest critics. She had spoken out against the girl, calling her a threat to the balance of the village. But when Ifiana had vanished, Nwando had also suffered. The power she once wielded had slowly waned, and now she could do nothing to heal the sickness that spread through the village. The people came to her in desperation, begging for a cure, but she could offer no relief. As the disease spread, she too felt the spirit of the forest closing in around her. One night, as she attempted a desperate ritual to cleanse the village, the spirits of the forest reached out to her. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air thickened with a malevolent presence. In a panic, Nwando fled into the woods, but no one ever saw her again. The villagers spoke of seeing her wandering the forest, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth moving as though she were speaking to something unseen. Some said she was possessed. Others claimed she had become one with the spirits, forever lost in the wilderness she had once sought to control. Then there was Oena, the young man who had stood by the village's decision to cast Ifiana. He had never known the girl, but he had been quick to join in the chorus of condemnation. His fate was more subtle but no less terrifying. He was slowly consumed by guilt, his conscience turning against him. The visions began at night, dark, shadowy figures calling his name, their faces twisted in anger. He would wake to find himself standing outside, staring into the forest, his body cold and trembling. He could never remember how he had gotten there. His once vibrant health began to deteriorate and his eyes grew dim. Eventually he disappeared, vanishing into the night, leaving only whispers behind. It was said that he was now a hollow shell, a body that walked but no longer lived, forever haunted by the spirits he had wronged. The village, once vibrant and full of life, now trembled in fear. The power of the spirits could not be denied. The elders too found themselves overwhelmed by guilt and fear. They sought to appease the spirits, performing rituals and sacrifices to win back favor, but nothing worked. The land itself seemed to be turning against them, and the village began to fracture. The people grew fearful of every shadow, every wind that whispered through the trees. The elders spoke of a curse so deep that it could not be broken, and the village began to turn in on itself, distrust and fear spreading like wildfire. And then there was Ifiana, who stood on the outskirts of the village, watching in silence. Her return had not been one of vengeance, nor of anger. She had no need for retribution. The village had already condemned itself through its actions. She had come not to punish but to guide, to help them understand the forces they had angered and to show them the path to redemption. But redemption was not something easily earned. The villagers had to understand that the spirits could not be appeased through simple acts of contrition. They had to learn to live in harmony with the land, to respect the forces they had so carelessly ignored. Ifiana became a revered figure in the village, though she never truly belonged to it. She was both part girl and part spirit, a being that was neither of this world nor of the next. Her presence was a reminder of the power that lay just beyond human understanding, the power of the land and the ancestors who watched over it. She moved through the village like a shadow, her eyes watching everything, yet her feet never seemed to touch the ground. She taught the people how to live in balance with nature, how to honor the spirits, and how to respect the sacredness of the land. She became their guide, their protector, but she never allowed them too close. She remained distant, a figure of mystery and reverence. As time passed, Ifiana's legend grew. The village began to change, slowly but surely. The sickness that had plagued them lifted, and the crops began to flourish once again. The villagers began to understand the importance of respecting the spirits, and they began to live in harmony with the land. But they never forgot Ifiana, the girl who had become a spirit, who had saved them but had never truly returned to them. Her legacy grew beyond the village, spreading to the surrounding lands. People spoke of the girl who had become both living and dead, who had returned from the forest to guide those who had wronged her. Her story became one of hope and redemption, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always the possibility of rebirth. Ifiana, for her part, remained a quiet force. She never asked for recognition, never sought to be worshipped. She was simply there, watching over the village she had once called home, but no longer truly belonged to. Her role as a teacher, guide, and protector was enough. In the end, Ifiana became not just a figure of the village's history, but a symbol of the land's power, a reminder that the spirits of the earth would always be watching, waiting for those who would dare to disrespect the balance. And though she was distant, she was never far. She was the spirit of the land, and the land, like her, would never be forgotten. The story of Ifiana is one that weaves together many powerful themes: betrayal, spiritual justice, transformation, and the immense power of ancestors. These elements come together to form a narrative that not only speaks of the suffering of one individual but also of the larger forces at play within our world, the forces of nature, of spirits, and of justice that transcend the boundaries of human understanding. It is a tale that touches upon the fragility of humanity, the repercussions of cruelty, and the way in which the past can come back to shape the present. Ifiana's journey is more than just a personal one. It is symbolic of how the forces we cannot see and control, like the spirits, the ancestors, and the land, can affect our lives, sometimes for the better but often for the worse when we fail to honor them. Betrayal is at the heart of this story. The villagers, in their arrogance and fear, had cast aside Ifiana, believing that by doing so, they would rid themselves of a curse. They believed they were doing what was best for their village, but in reality, they had committed an unforgivable act. They had betrayed the trust and respect of the spirits. Ifiana's abandonment was not just an act of cruelty against one person, it was a profound insult to the natural order. In their haste to discard her, the villagers severed the connection between themselves and the forces that had long protected them. The very land they relied on, the spirits they once respected, turned against them in ways they could not anticipate. What happened next, though, is where the theme of spiritual justice comes into play. The spirits of the forest, angered by this betrayal, set in motion a chain of events that would bring balance back to the world. The villagers began to feel the consequences of their actions. Their crops withered, sickness spread, and the very land they had once trusted seemed to turn against them. It was a manifestation of spiritual justice, not a vengeful act, but a necessary correction of the imbalance that had been created by their disrespect. In Ifiana's return, the spirits did not simply seek to punish, but to restore what had been lost, to show the villagers the path of redemption. They did not come with violence but with the subtle power of transformation, a reminder that disrespecting the spiritual world could lead to profound consequences, but also that the opportunity for healing and growth would always exist, provided they were willing to listen. Transformation is another central theme in Ifianya's story. The girl who was once broken, abandoned, and forgotten becomes a figure of immense power. Her rebirth in the forest transforms her from a helpless victim into a being of strength and wisdom. Ifiana is no longer just a girl, she is something more, something that transcends the limits of human experience. She becomes both human and spirit, a bridge between the living and the dead, a guardian of the balance between the two. This transformation is not just physical but spiritual, as she evolves from the girl who had been betrayed by her village into a being who understands the deep, ancient truths of the land and its spirits. Her rebirth is a testament to the power of resilience and the ability of the human spirit to transform even the most painful experiences into sources of strength and wisdom. The theme of ancestral power is deeply embedded in Ifianya's journey as well. It is the power of the ancestors that saves her, that grants her the strength to return to the village. It is their knowledge and their protection that guide her as she becomes a spiritual guide for the people who had once forsaken her. The ancestors, through their connection to the land, are always watching, always ready to step in when balance is threatened. Their power is not something that can be seen or measured in conventional ways, but it is a force that is deeply felt, a presence that lingers just beneath the surface of daily life. Ifianya's transformation is in part a manifestation of this ancestral power. She becomes the vessel through which the spirits communicate with the living, and it is through her that the villagers learn to respect and live in harmony with the forces that govern their world. Now, when we look at Ifiana as she stands between two worlds, the world of the living and the world of the spirits, her story leaves us with a powerful image. A girl who was once broken, abandoned, and forgotten, now walks with strength, wisdom, and purpose, a guardian of the delicate balance between life and death. She is neither fully alive nor fully dead, but exists in a state that transcends both. This image of Ifiana walking between two worlds reminds us of the power of transformation, of how the forces of the spirit world can shape and mold us into something greater than we ever imagined. It speaks to the potential for rebirth, for growth, even in the darkest of circumstances. Her legacy grows beyond the village, beyond the forest. Her story becomes a beacon of hope, a reminder that even the deepest betrayals can be overcome, that spiritual justice, though often delayed, will always find its way. The villagers who once wronged her now look to her with reverence, but they also look to her with fear, knowing that the spirits are watching, that the balance must be maintained. Ifiana teaches them that redemption is possible, but only if they learn to respect the spirits, to honor the land, and to live in harmony with the world around them. And now, as we reflect on Ifianya's journey, we are left with a question. Do you believe the forest watches us? Can a soul come back stronger than before? These questions challenge us to think about the unseen forces that shape our lives. Do we truly understand the power of the spiritual world, or are we blind to the forces that surround us? And what about Ifiana? Can we, too, find strength in our pain and betrayal, transforming our suffering into something greater? Her story is a testament to the power of the human spirit, to the way in which we can find healing and strength even in the darkest moments. What would you have done if she came to your village? Would you have been one of the villagers who wronged her, or would you have been a voice of compassion, of understanding? Ifianya's story asks us to reflect on our own actions, our own relationship with the spiritual world. It asks us to consider how we treat others, how we treat the land, and how we honor the ancestors who came before us. In the end, Ifiana is not just a figure of folklore, she is a symbol of what can happen when we disrespect the forces that govern our world, and of what is possible when we seek to heal, to transform, and to live in balance with the spirits that watch over us. Her journey teaches us that even the most broken parts of ourselves can be transformed, that the deepest betrayals can lead to the most profound growth, and that the spirits of the earth are always watching, waiting, and ready to guide us back to the path of balance. Ifianya's legacy is not just her own, it is a lesson for all of us.